Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the Happy Hour, Olga Peters, and I'm so glad you can join us today. We are being joined, of course, by regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of three representatives from the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga.
So glad you can be with us today. And then also Selene Colburn, who you may remember from previous episodes when she was a state rep. And she is now the co-director of Vermont's Council on Domestic Violence and also a member of the Vermont Network for a Violence-Free Vermont. I'm so glad you can join us today, Selena.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm glad we can talk today about Bill H-27, which passed the House last week. And it is a bill to add new language to the definition of abuse, which is coercive controlling behavior for the purposes of obtaining an abuse from a relief from abuse prevention order. I'm sorry, I said that wrong again. For obtaining a civil abuse prevention order against a family or household member. I just wanted to get that right from the bill. Selena, my first question with a bill like this that is doing something like updating language, it feels a little bit like it could almost be called a housekeeping bill, but I know it does more than that. So help us understand why changing the definition of abuse or updating it is important in your line of work.
Yeah, and I'll thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the underlying relief from abuse process in Vermont.
Perfect.
So you did get that right. We call them relief from abuse orders, and it's part of our civil court proceedings, so not something that occurs in criminal court. And in Vermont, folks who are experiencing intimate partner violence, stalking, or sexual violence have recourse to protection orders through the civil court process. They can get what's called a temporary or ex parte order that will last for a finite amount of time, and then they can also pursue a final order that is longer in duration potentially. And these orders come with accompanying conditions often around contact or certain behaviors. So again, it's not a criminal proceeding, although if you were to violate the conditions of your order, that does come with potential criminal liability.
And Selena, is this what, when we talk about these orders, it's what most people might think of when they think of a restraining order?
Exactly,
Okay,
right.
thank you.
Yes, so a judge would grant the order, and there are numerous conditions that could be imposed. So no contact might be a condition, sort of mediated contact, living arrangements. A person might actually be asked to engage in domestic violence accountability programming. So each order is going to be pretty case specific in what it looks like, but the idea is that it provides really important protections for a survivor, in this case of intimate partner violence. And often these are key to folks being able to do the safety planning they need to do to be able to make changes for their own safety, or simply just to get a breather from the abuse and be able to regroup and reassess. And one of the things that we know is that anytime a survivor of intimate partner violence comes forward, that can actually be a time that increases risk. So these kind of protection orders can be a really important tool for survivors in Vermont to create conditions where they can come forward safely, or just exist more safely. And currently, so the definitions of what constitutes abuse in this part of our statute currently, that really needs to rise to the level of physical violence.
Mm-hmm.
But what we know, so coercive control, this bill adds coercive control so that someone essentially doesn't have to wait until they get to the point of experiencing, extreme, severe physical violence to ask for protection and help. So coercive control might look like limiting someone's access to transportation or finances or resources, threatening children or pets. If you do X, Y, or Z, I'm going to harm our dog. And I thought it was really interesting to see that animal welfare advocates actually joined the folks who supported this bill, because that's such a common thing. It might look like persistent, degrading verbal abuse, psychological manipulation, isolating folks, preventing them from being in community in any number of ways, including employment, monitoring or controlling activities, threatening someone about their immigration status. And research shows us that these kinds of behaviors that we can call the whole suite of these behaviors coercive control are often a predictor of violence and, unfortunately, of lethality as well. So there's a pretty large body of research that shows that.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
That coercive control can be a precursor to violence. So we at the network really see.
And I guess I'm asking because I think people often really put a pretty stark line between those. I hear people putting a very stark line between those two things, that like, well, he's not physically abusive, or they're not physically abusive. And that's like always. And so they can handle it, or that, they'll work through it, or. Yeah.
So domestic violence or intimate partner violence or abuse, at the network, we really see that as a spectrum of behaviors. And research shows that over time, some of those more controlling behaviors can escalate to violence. So I think you can find all kinds of studies, well, all kinds of numbers, but something like 5 times, I think I recently saw a study that said 9 times more likely to experience violence from a partner if you're already subject to those coercive controlling behaviors. And certainly many of them are indicators in lethality assessments. So in the field of intimate partner violence, there's several tools out there. One that we're in the process of adopting more widely in Vermont, called the lethality assessment program, that really helps to identify risk for someone being murdered by a partner. And many of these behaviors are part of lethality assessments. So, there's looking over the testimony on this bill. There is a story that my colleagues at the network brought forward just as an example of what coercive control can look like. And so it was a person who had been fairly isolated by her partner, was raising kids together, that her activities were being monitored to make sure she wasn't, contacting people, etc. And the partner took the car seats out of the back of their vehicle, which effectively meant that the partner couldn't travel safely with her children because she couldn't put car seats in the vehicle. And so that's what coercive control can look like. And unfortunately, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that example came from a case review from Vermont's Domestic Violence Fatality Review Commission, which is a large body that looks at, takes some of the homicides that occur, domestic violence homicides that occur in the state, and really does reviews of them to try to identify opportunities for change and better intervention. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Emily, before the show, we were chatting a little bit, and you mentioned a few things, one of which was how this bill sort of came to the State House, but also that you thought it was really important that people understand that a bill like this is as much about public safety as a bill that might oversee law enforcement. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, a big emphasis this year in the legislature, and actually has been a big emphasis over the last few years, is public safety and health. And when we look at where and why people are dying in Vermont, or where and why even the vast majority of police calls come from, that is intimate partner violence. And then overdoses, basically. And so, last 2 weeks, sometime in the last few weeks, we talked about overdose prevention centers, and we're going to talk about that again soon, because that bill just passed the House. But this, intimate partner violence and the scale of it in Vermont, both the lethality of it and the day-to-day profound impact on people's lives and ability to live their lives, is really profound and really widespread, and we just don't really talk about it, despite the fact that we have the network on the show every year, despite the fact that absolutely everyone I know, at least, knows a few people who have experienced intimate partner violence or sexual violence. It still stays like very much in the shadows and isn't spoken about. So, this weekend I was noticing, our police department often posts on social media when they have arrests. And half the arrests that they were posting about were about intimate partner violence. And, we could have another conversation or a conversation later about whether arrests are necessarily the best strategy in the case of intimate partner violence. But regardless, it's not where the public's mind goes when we talk about public safety. And so I think it's really important that we are expanding that conversation, that we're supporting the organizations that are there trying to prevent, not just respond to intimate partner violence. And that when we look at bills like this that strengthen folks' ability to stay safe, sometimes even in their own homes, that we look at it in that context. And Representative Angela Allen, who is the reporter for the bill on the House floor, was really eloquent about sort of how this bill fit into that wider picture.
Well, it's a good frame to be explicit about, because I think you're right when you talk about how much domestic violence remains in the shadows. It's, when I just kind of sat with that for a minute, I realized that, yeah, I too, when I think of public safety, I think of probably those crimes that are likely to be like a little more widespread across many different people, like breaking into cars or theft, or, crimes that don't necessarily have one specific person hurting another specific person. Does that make sense? Like those
Property
crimes that feel
crimes.
more random.
Yeah, property crimes. Yeah,
Property
absolutely. And I
crimes.
think that's where most of the emphasis tends to go in public conversation. And I think partly that's because that feels a lot newer for Vermont. But, even when we work on firearm regulation in Vermont, it's, that's about suicides and intimate partner violence for the most part. It's not, it's very rare. The guns are very rarely used in Vermont for other things, but they're almost, non-hunting uses of guns is almost always about coercive control or suicide in Vermont, and sometimes both at the same time.
Well, I think it also
like
comes
how I said that
down...
upbeat at the end. Selena, it looked like you wanted to say something there.
Oh, no, that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
Olga.
Oh, I was just going to say, well, I think it also comes down to some of the stories we tell about crime.
Mhm.
I think we often tell ourselves, oh, well, someone who hurts their family members, they're a dirtbag, or I can't possibly know anyone like that. Right? Where we tell different stories about petty criminals per se,
It's
or
interesting.
petty property crime.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with my partner maybe a decade ago, and trying to be clear that, like, if 90% of the women that I know have experienced some form of sexual violence, then probably the majority of the men that we know have probably enacted that sexual violence. And it was just like absolutely inconceivable that somehow this could happen to all women, but not be something that was sort of normal behavior in men. And it's just like, it's wild how hard it is, I mean, across most policy to just like sort of sit with what actually is.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Selena?
Yeah, I mean, would the greatest indicate, well, I guess I could ask, do you know what the greatest indicator of perpetrating intimate partner violence is? It's having grown up in a household with intimate partner violence. And so this conversation is very, very moving to me, given some of the other work that we do with Vermont's Domestic Violence Council, which is actually try to provide programming and resources to folks who cause harm in intimate partner violence settings. And we're trying really hard to continue to innovate and iterate interventions that work for folks and that recognize, unfortunately, a lot of folks who commit violence are themselves survivors of violence. And so happy to talk way more about that body of work, which is really interesting. But I would say that this, bringing us back to this bill, I would say that this fits into a overall pattern of what we're hoping to do in our work at the network and the council, which is create more pathways for survivors and folks who cause harm to interrupt these patterns and cycles sooner and before they lead to get to the point of violence and lethality. So, that's part of what is so important about this bill, is that it gives a survivor an option to, we have heard from member organizations and advocates, and this is true in other states that have enacted this same policy. I think there's 6 or 7 other states that have similar legislation, that folks, have of folks being unable to obtain those protection orders because they haven't been hit, essentially, and almost having this feeling of like, oh, if only this person had hit me just once, then I could be safe, So I think there's a lot of things we're trying to do, including this bill, that get folks to be able to interrupt these patterns sooner. And some are for survivors, and some are for folks who are causing harm and violence, where there's that often, like, we would like to create more pathways for those folks to get help as before getting to the point of a criminal proceeding as well.
Can you tell us a bit more about this council?
Yeah, so the Vermont's Council on Domestic Violence, it's a roughly a 40-person body. So it's a large body that was originally created through executive order when Peter Shumlin was the governor, and now exists in Vermont statute. We meet quarterly, and it's a multidisciplinary group. So it's a really provides really fascinating opportunity to get perspectives from such a wide range of folks who are engaged in work around intimate partner violence. So that includes regional representatives from each county in Vermont has a task force on domestic violence, and there are regional representatives to the council from that work, many of them folks who work at member organizations of the Vermont Network, which are the local domestic and sexual violence service providers throughout the state. It includes law enforcement, and includes defense attorneys, and includes prosecutors, so it includes judges, like folks from the criminal legal system are well represented there. It includes folks who provide programming for people who commit intimate partner violence, and much more. And we meet quarterly, and we have several charges in Vermont statute. One is really just to look overall at Vermont's domestic violence response, our system of response, and suggests innovations and improvements that can further protect survivors. And then there's a large body of work that the council oversees, which is as I've mentioned a couple of times, programming for folks who engage in intimate partner violence. So there are 12 certified programs throughout the state. And they use a wide range of curricula. And the role of the council is to provide oversight and certification. We have a very robust certification process to ensure the value and integrity of this programming and its relevance to communities. So these programs are certified, they get oversight, training, technical assistance from us. We're in the process of doing a lot of data and evaluation work with them, so we can learn a lot more about how the work is moving forward in Vermont, and where there's room for improvement and change. And now we provide some funding to these programs, which is actually quite new. Many years ago, Vermont essentially defunded this programming, and it went through a real change, and the revenue for the funding came from fees from folks participating in the program, which on the surface of it sounds like, wow, that actually sounds like good accountability. But in reality, many of the folks who go through this programming are still in relationships or co-living or co-parenting relationships with survivors. And, that money is essentially coming out of the pockets of survivors, or sometimes if folks couldn't pay their weekly fee, it was really preventing people from participating in the programming. So I'm very pleased to say that a couple of years ago, Vermont provided some funding for this programming that allowed us to eliminate participant fees, and we're one of a handful of jurisdictions where that's true around the country.
Thank you. Emily, we have just under 5 minutes before we need to hear from some underwriters. Remind us, H27 has passed the House. It still needs to go to the Senate, correct?
So sort of flight plan, traffic control updates. Yes, it passed the House, still needs to go to the Senate. It's been you might notice that it's called H27. That means it was the 27th bill introduced this biennium. So it was likely introduced the very first day of the last session.
Interesting.
And so it has spent a lot of time in the House, and it was not ignored. It's had a lot of work done and a huge amount of testimony, which sort of bodes better for its time in the Senate. It's not guaranteed, but a lot of people have paid sort of a lot of attention, worked through whatever they needed to work through on this bill. It was also interestingly, there was virtually no debate on this bill. I don't know if there was actually any debate on this bill at all. And yet, quite a few Republicans voted against it.
Mhm.
Not all of them. It was not on party lines, but about 20 or so. Is that right, Selena?
There wasn't a roll call, it was a voice vote.
Oh, there was
So
a roll call the second day,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah,
oh, I missed that.
Sorry, and
Emily
you weren't
Long, I
there. I'm
think,
sorry.
called for
So
it.
there
Well,
was a roll call. It was around 20. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah.
But it was, but it's still not clear why people voted against it. And maybe that will become clearer during its time in the Senate or not. I'm not really sure. And so it has a number of months to finish its work in the Senate, and then it would go to the governor for signature. It's not clear what the governor's take on the bill is. I don't think he's participated in the conversations thus far, because he usually doesn't. But again, you know, this council that Selena described is a very broad representation and sees this as a really important part of the work. And then sort of while I'm doing interesting traffic control things related to legislation, I think there's also a really interesting aspect of the bill, which is Selena's status with it all, that I think is sort of worth explaining before we go to the break, if we can, Olga.
Sure.
So the legislature has a very really small number of ethics provisions in place compared to some other states, or certainly compared to the federal government. We know how well that works out. And a lot of that is, we could do a whole show about that, but a lot of it is related to sort of like, it's a tiny state, so everyone just does the best they can kind of thinking. But one of the rules we do have is after leaving the legislature or the administration, after working in either of those places, you are banned from engaging in lobbying for a year. And Selena just finished her year.
Yeah. It's true. 4 weeks ago, I would have been like, sorry, gonna have to talk to somebody else.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
And this was
Yeah.
like a policy area that you worked on when you were in the legislature, a little bit, right? It was in your committee.
I think this actually went through the all the ethics provisions and stuff went through government operations, and none of it ever
Interesting.
came
Okay.
through judiciary. But yeah, I do think it's a really important provision. And when I went and really looked at it, I was surprised to see actually how broadly lobbying was constructed, because I think just word of mouth, I had understood like, oh, you just can't register as a lobbyist. You know, you can't be a registered lobbyist, but it's actually
Right.
much more broad than that. And yeah, I think it's a really good thing. And just, you know, it's meant to prevent a revolving door of someone just like immediately just like coming in and leveraging all their experience in the legislature to be a lobbyist. But I found it really helpful to step back and have some time to germinate before just jumping right into advocating for legislation. So I took it pretty seriously.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because that is an interesting little piece of inside baseball. And it reminds us just how relationship-based Vermont is. And sometimes, yeah, you do need to step back from those relationships. Well,
And I just want to add, interestingly, though, staff can move freely between the administration and the legislature with no pauses in place. And I think I have some questions about sort of how that works out in the short and long term.
so
But
just
that's a
give
conversation
us
for
an
another day.
example, Emily. So like the head of
So-
VTrans or something, or
So
like,
recently, sort of two very recent examples that are in my own life. Recently, the deputy director of our joint fiscal office went to essentially become the deputy director of the administration, the
okay,
agency of administration. And the head legal, you know, one of the members of legal counsel who worked on tax policy just left to work for the tax department. And they don't have any real boundaries in place with regard to their work, because they're not moving to the private sector.
okay. Thank you.
And
Yeah, that
similarly,
is
someone
intriguing.
could be in the administration and then run for office, and you know, there's examples of that as well.
Okay, thank you. So we on the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, are going to hear from some of our underwriters, and we will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on many of the media centers, websites, or TV stations around Vermont, thanks to Brattleboro Community Television, taking the video version of this video and sharing it throughout the state. I want to thank them for that. Of course, you can also subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts. And Emily, what should we remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests respectively, and not the station, platform, employer, nor friends.
Thank you very much. And if you're just joining us, of course, that was the lovely Emily Kornheiser, one of 3 reps from Brattleboro. And we are also talking with Selene Colburn, who is the co-director of Vermont's Council on Domestic Violence and also a member of the Vermont Network for a Violence-Free Vermont. And we are talking about Bill H-27, which passed the House last week, and it adds new language to the definition of abuse. It adds the language of coercive and controlling behavior. And this is for people who are obtaining a civil abuse prevention order against a family member or a member of their household. Selena, what are you thinking? You know, I always try to think when I'm looking at an issue for a newspaper or article, I always try to think of like, who might not agree with this and what might they say? What might their concerns be? And I'm curious for you, as someone who is working in the prevention of domestic violence, what are some of the things you hear when a bill like this comes forward?
So I think one of the biggest concerns that folks have, it's a very legitimate concern, is that this language might actually be able to be used against folks who are actually experiencing abuse. That's true of all of our statute in Vermont, and that is another form of abuse, is to
Bullies like to bully.
Use the court process to kind of counter, anything that a survivor might be bringing forward, or simply as another means of control. I think we're very lucky that in this biennium in Vermont, the legislature also passed, and it was signed by the governor and enacted into law, H-45, which is a bill that specifically addresses abusive litigation, and provides a process for a survivor to essentially file a court order identifying certain kinds of filings as abusive litigation, which a judge can then interrupt. We also know there's significant judicial training that will be required around that bill. And there's also just interest in training largely across our system, criminal legal system, partly as a result of the work of a multi-year grant that we call the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, looking at domestic violence systems in the state. So, legislation always has an implementation phase. In this case, I think there's the potential for significant training to really support all of our legislation around domestic violence prevention and response. I think it's clear looking at the legislature's work on this, which because of the provision that we were talking about, I wasn't, sitting in committee room every day through the 9 different drafts that the Vermont House Judiciary Committee went through with this bill, but they really clearly took a lot of testimony, thought about the language and how to balance it against constitutionally protected rights to speech. And that's really reflected in the final language, around what would constitute exceptions to this law. And, you know, I think the other objection that folks might voice is just sort of similar to what you all were sharing at the top of the hour as we introduced the topic, just feeling like, well, this is just, nobody's getting physically abused. Like, this is just things that are happening between two people. And, you know, frankly, that's an argument that, a longstanding argument against any efforts to regulate how we respond to intimate partner violence. That just is not borne out by the research that about these behaviors and what's known at this point. People have really studied what constitutes coercive control and how it relates to a spectrum of violence.
Thank you. Emily, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, actually. Nothing's coming to me at all. Yeah. I think Selena, yeah, has got it.
That was perfect.
Mhm.
Nice summary.
Yeah.
Thank you, Selena. You know, in the first half of the show, you mentioned a few times, Selena, that the work in around intimate partner violence is not always focused just on survivors. There is also, you know, restorative justice aspect and a prevention aspect. Emily, did you have some questions around that?
I mean, frankly, that's like pretty new stuff that we're talking about. In terms of sort of the state's role in those conversations, or even our violence prevention sort of community partners taking on questions around what it means to engage with, you know, perpetrators in our community, what it means to be in community with people who engage in violence and controlling behaviors, how restorative justice could possibly feel safe for someone who's experienced intimate partner violence. I think those are all like really big questions that have kept a lot of folks away from doing some of this work that I think the network has really taken on in earnest over the last couple of years. And it's important, but it's a shift. And so, yeah, I would love to hear more about sort of how you, Selena, see this fitting into that conversation and what next steps might look like and what's hard about all that or beautiful.
Yeah. Well, that's a really big question.
I know.
How I might
We want to
respond
keep
to
people
it.
hooked in the second half with big questions.
Yeah, I think how I might respond to it is talk about some of the innovative ways that we are starting, some of the longstanding and new innovative ways that we are engaging with folks who cause harm at the network and beyond. Does that sound like a good way to answer your question?
I love it.
Let's start there.
So like I said, we do have a system of domestic violence accountability programming in the state. That whole model is, you know, relatively new. I mean, as the gender-based violence movement grew out of sort of what we might call second wave feminism and started to really bring intimate partner violence and sexual violence kind of out of the shadows as where it had lived as these sort of personal experiences to a realization that these were more universal and often gender-based experiences. Folks started figuring out, well, how do we interrupt? We've like learned a lot about what the patterns look like. How do we interrupt it? And how can we engage with folks who are actually causing harm? And so there was programming that was evolved. And a lot of the early programming really lives in the frame of a gender analysis of folks who cause harm, which there's some real validity to that, and it might not capture the whole picture of why people are engaging in harm in intimate partner relationships. And it certainly ignores the reality that folks of all genders, all gender identities experience and cause harm in intimate partner relationships, including serious physical harm and violence. So that programming has been kind of like evolving, you know, over several decades now. There's starting to be a modest body of research around it. We do know from what I'd call some of the meta-analyses that are out there, which is like looking at the whole body of research and trying to figure out what patterns it tells us.
I just want listeners to know that Selene Colburn is also trained as a librarian, so sometimes she uses extra dorky words.
Yeah, so she's a big dork. Well, we're doing a lot of work right now around research and evaluation of this programming, so I'm a little deep in it. I apologize, but there's some research that says this kind of programming does reduce what we would call recidivism, both of, so that means just recommitting a crime, both of specifically domestic violence crimes and even just crime in general. So it is research tells us it's associated with those reductions. But it's also, the research is also mixed, and it's especially mixed mostly because there's so little of it about what the impact of the programming is on survivors, which is always, you know, our goal, including when we're working with folks who cause harm, is to improve the experience and safety of survivors. And so we're seeing we've introduced some new programming in Vermont this year that uses a model from the Alma Center, which is a Wisconsin-based organization that they call their modality healing focused care. That's being implemented in the Northeast Kingdom, and actually being implemented by Umbrella, which is a member organization that serves survivors of domestic and sexual violence, a member organization of the network where I work. And that's actually pretty new. And historically, like in the movement, a lot of the folks who work with survivors are like, we don't work with the people who cause harm, even though those two people might be in relationship to one another.
And might stay in relationship. I think, that's something we've covered in various episodes, is that like interventions that try to fully cleave a relationship are often quite doomed to failure.
It might not be what the survivor is looking for.
Yeah.
So we're seeing that's a really interesting model that we're watching closely. Another thing that Umbrella has introduced to the state, that has been kind of mostly based in the Northeast Kingdom, but is starting to expand statewide, is we've created a warm line, what we call a warm line, based on something called a call for change in Western Massachusetts, and this is an anonymous, non-carceral approach where someone who is at risk of causing harm in a relationship can call and ask for like support and intervention and help with their process of change. So it's not a hotline. It's not like you would call and be like, I'm about to, do something really, really, really harmful. And the police need to arrive or whatever. It's not really the focus of this so much. It's more like helping people who want interruption to interrupt those behaviors. And I just was meeting with the folks at Umbrella last week, and they told me that they, just had a new person who called the warm line, who then self-referred themselves into the accountability programming, which is very, very rare. That accounts for probably under 5% of our referrals currently. Most of the referrals to that programming come from Department of Corrections or Department of Children and Families, but we're really trying to create more pathway. And for a long time, actually, you couldn't access that programming unless you'd been adjudicated.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So like, again, this idea of like, how do we interrupt things more upstream instead of waiting, you know?
And I know in so many other interventions, they're much more effective if someone engages with them consensually rather than through a
Right.
mandatory or court order, right? So I imagine
Right.
someone who's self-referring is certainly more open to doing the work that they need to do to shift their patterns. It's sort of, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing in that I understand how much effort it took in America for people to be attending to the folks who experienced harm, right? And to survivors. And so I understand why, given that, and given really all of our inability to hold multiple truths simultaneously, sorry, everyone, this is like my deep theme of the many months lately, that we would sort of move away from engaging with the folks who perpetrated the harm. But we are all stuck in these communities together, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
And why I don't want to be in community with someone who perpetrates violence and then has no recourse for themselves to think about that even, or to do something about that, or to be, you know, held and engaged with any hope for change, right? Like, you know, earlier in the show, you talked about the number one, you know, indicator that this would happen in a relationship is that someone, you know, grew up experiencing this in their own household. And so like, if we're ever going to make any difference, yes, we need to attend to impact, but we also need to recognize that we're all just walking around in a lot of pain all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe that is a good segue into talking a little bit about Act 11, which is in the process of creating new pathways for access to restorative justice in circumstances of sexual or domestic violence. So Vermont has a system of what we call community justice centers. Each county has one. A handful of counties have more than one that deliver restorative justice services, sometimes for mostly, I would say, probably for court-involved people, but sometimes just as a community.
Brattleboro finally only has one because our two merged with each other.
Yes.
So that feels really
yes.
exciting.
Yeah. And
We're very
actually
proud.
someone from, I'm happy to say that someone from that merged organization serves on the advisory board for the implementation of Act 11. So Act 11 is a bill that passed last year, another House bill, another priority bill of the Vermont Network. It was known as H41 back then. And when the community justice centers were codified in statute in 2009, the Vermont Network and others, but the Vermont Network actually asked for language that said these organizations cannot take sexual or domestic violence cases. Like we are not sure that how this would work with restorative justice really was not happening demonstrably in many parts of the country at that point in time. And there was honestly fear about it. Since then, the network really reversed. Are we at time, or do we have a couple
No,
minutes?
we're good. Thank
Okay.
you for asking though.
Are you good though?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the network really came to change its thinking about this and started to reinitiate conversations with the legislature, and partly because you know what we were seeing, what our member organizations were seeing, what folks around the country are seeing, because there's quite a growing interest in the idea of using restorative justice for gender-based violence is that the criminal legal system really often doesn't center the needs of survivors in the way that restorative justice does, if it's done well and done, you know, in a way that embraces the underlying principles of restorative justice. Once a survivor or victim reports, the state really becomes the party, not the victim or survivor in a criminal legal case. And so the needs of the survivor might be centered and honored as best as possible by a prosecutor who really has that lens and inclination, but that there's no guarantee, and many people feel underserved by that setting in a bunch of ways, or might go through the whole process of adjudication and have a successful or unsuccessful outcome and feel like their needs weren't met either way. So restorative justice, there are many more folks starting to practice this in the gender-based violence movement. And knowing that and seeing that and sort of hearing stories and being part of the conversation, the network started to really change its position. In 2019, the legislature did a study that indicated that there were some restorative justice could be an important tool. And then last year, the legislature actually passed a bill that removed that essentially prohibition on community justice centers providing restorative justice in cases of domestic or sexual violence.
And I'll tell you, as someone who worked at a restorative justice center when I worked at youth services, terribly named youth services because the majority of the folks that youth services served are not youth. It was really remarkable how often we would be referred cases and very quickly realize that there was some aspect of intimate partner violence involved in it, and then having to sort of return or reject the case. Sometimes once it had already been picked up, and it was really like a major challenging sort of issue in our ability to serve the community effectively.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And no one was trained to handle it either, which was, you know, I hope one piece that we're working on. Yes.
Yes, we're working on that. And in fact, have some really exciting things happening tomorrow and beyond about that in Vermont. So yes, the language passed, and now the way it's going to work is that if a domestic or sexual violence service provider partners with a community justice center to develop a model for restorative justice, and they create a memorandum of understanding that addresses a whole bunch of criteria, including, you know, survivor safety and what kind of model is going to be used and what indicators there are that that's an evidence-based or promising model, what kind of evaluation will be in place, et cetera, et cetera. Lots and lots of criteria. In fact, frankly, many more criteria than a criminal legal system is expected to address in statute to engage with a survivor of domestic or sexual violence, in my opinion. But so we're working right now with the Attorney General, the Community Justice Unit of the Attorney General's Office and the Center for Crime Victim Services in Vermont to like develop some guidance for folks who want to develop this programming in alignment with this criteria. That's the statute, and by July 1 we'll be releasing that guidance. But in the interim, we're doing lots of work, lots of conversations with folks to think about how this might work, how this might look. We did a great panel with last year in November with folks who are practicing around the country restorative justice in cases of gender-based violence, and we opened that up to folks all around the country. And they're, you know, like, just to speaking to the national interest in this, I think there were almost 400 people registered for it. And this month, we have Sujatha Balaga, who's a provider, a former lawyer who is a restorative justice practitioner and works on these kind of cases. is providing some training in Vermont. So actually tomorrow she's teaching at Middlebury, and she's opened her class up to a number of community folks. I'm going to be there. And then she's providing a much more hands-on workshop to folks who are interested in iterating this program towards the end of the month. So we are getting as much training
so
as we
exciting.
possibly can. And it's really exciting. And it could look, I'll just close by saying, like, restorative justice could look so many different ways for survivors. And I think it's been really fascinating to see how challenging that is for lots of folks in the conversation, including sometimes us, to wrap our heads around. Like, it might look like someone getting a criminal citation and being referred to that programming with or without, a diversion, like any kind of path that dismisses the charges. But it might also just look like a survivor coming to a program and say, I don't want to engage with the person who caused this harm at all, but there's some really unmet needs I have as a result of the harm that I experienced. And then that gives the opportunity for the community justice center to basically say, how can the community help? How can we help to restore and repair the harm that happened to you?
I really want to just pause and appreciate how clearly you described those options, and of course the whole spectrum around and between. That a community justice center, it's about the community being engaged in the repair. It's not just about the two people or few people who are sitting at the center.
Yeah, and it's really interesting as we prepared for this panel that we hosted back in November. We heard a lot of real life examples of cases that folks had taken on, and there were many examples where the situation was really about repair among family and friends who hadn't believed, hadn't supported, had put up barriers to the person's access to help or healing. There's so many different ways this could look. It could look like someone coming into a community justice center and trying to, either as a person who causes harm, survivor, or both, trying to interrupt their own coercive controlling behavior before it gets to a level of violence. Or it could look like someone who 20 years ago went through the criminal legal system, successfully had a case that was adjudicated where someone, was served time for criminal charges, and they still are like, I have a whole bunch of stuff that's really unresolved. Maybe I want to talk to that person about what happened, or maybe I don't, but I have something else. So it could look so many different ways. And if we do it well and right in Vermont, how we're going to define those ways in any given situation is by really centering the needs of survivors. And that's what's so exciting about it, because we currently, our member organizations do incredible work, and our criminal legal system has the constraints that it has. And I know there's good folks really trying to serve survivors there, but this is like truly a new modality that potentially really, really asks survivors what they need.
Thank you. Unfortunately, Selena, we are out of time, but I think that's a great place to end, to remember focusing on what survivors need. Selene Colburn, if people want to find out more about the work of the Vermont Network or the Vermont Council on Domestic Violence, where can they go?
Oh, that is such a great question. Well, so all you have to do is Google Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and you can find the website of the Vermont Network. And let me tell you the exact URL of the Vermont Council on Domestic Violence. And I will put in a plug and say, if you are listening and you're someone who's thinking, wow, I could really use help. So the Vermont Domestic Violence Council website is all one word, vtdvcouncil.org. And we have a whole page there about how to access domestic violence accountability programming. So if you're someone who's listening and thinking I could really use that help and intervention for myself or for someone I care about, you are welcome to enter that programming yourself. And like I said, there's no fee.
Thank you. And for listeners, just so you know, I'll also link that in the show notes of the podcast. So you can find that information there as well. Emily, if folks want to find out more about you.
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and sign up for my newsletter or find contact information for all the various ways to be in touch.
Thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 and rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings. So take care, everyone. Have a good weekend, and we will see you in the next episode.